Good morning. This is Barry Bryson again with 5 Good Minutes from God's Word. And today we're introducing the Gospel of Matthew. Yesterday, when we introduced the Gospels together, we talked about the meaning of the word gospel and what a gospel was. And before we talk about Matthew, I just want to say a little more about that. Gospel is good news, of course. That's what the word means. It's a translation of the Greek word euangelion, which is a good message. Good news, and gospel is a book about Jesus. A gospel is a specific genre of history, and there are varieties of genres of histories and ways of writing history, not only in our own language, but in the Bible itself. The book of Genesis is a domestic history filled with family stories. We can compare the books of First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, which cover the same time period and the same historic events, and one of them is written like the court records that they are, Chronicles. The other is written more like Team of Rivals or Undaunted Courage, a popular history written almost in novelistic form. A gospel is a biography, but a particular kind of biography. It's a theological biography, placing Jesus in theological context, but also offering us up the man alive, because the word is alive and active. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12. It's not a biography the way Parson Weems' biography of George Washington was a biography, and that it made up stories, and George Washington was this perfect figure. Jesus is a perfect figure, but he's also very human. And he gets irritated and has a testy relationship with his mother at times, and gets angry at times, and the people around him certainly are not saints in any way. That we use that word in English, but many of them become saints through his blood. Okay, let's talk about Matthew. Matthew, who is he? He's a tax collector. He's part of the corrupt political establishment. He's called by Jesus one day out of the blue when Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he sees him there collecting taxes. And he follows Jesus. The call is surprising to us, and so is his following of Jesus. Matthew's gospel is distinct in several ways. It is a Jewish gospel. As I said yesterday, Matthew doesn't take any time explaining Jewish terminology or Jewish customs. He expects that his readers are going to understand them already because they are Jews or have come from a Jewish background. In fact, Matthew may very well have been written in an Aramaic or a Hebrew or original. He begins with the formal genealogy of Jesus, taking Jesus back through David and through Abraham. Matthew's gospel is structured, it seems to be structured, I should say, around 5 major discourses. And I don't think that number is a coincidence because there are 5 books of law. Although there isn't really a parallel between the 5 discourses and the 5 books, the number 5 may be significant in that way. The first discourse is the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll talk a lot more about tomorrow, Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And then the second discourse is the missionary discourse in chapter 10, when he sends out the 12, and he spends a long time instructing them on how they should behave on the mission field. The third discourse is the parable discourse in chapter 13, which is a collection of parables with an explanation. Jesus has already taught us how to read a parable in the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll notice tomorrow. The kingdom discourse in Matthew chapter 18 is about how we live our lives based upon the grace that we have received. And then the eschatological discourse, or the discourse about end things, takes place in Matthew chapters 24 and 25. It's important when we read this course to listen to the questions. The apostles ask multiple questions, and Jesus answers every one of their questions. They're not the same question. And when we read this discourse, we try to conflate the end of Jerusalem with the end of the world. We can't do that. There are some other distinctive features that we like to talk about. Jesus' birth narrative in Matthew is taken from his father's perspective, from Joseph's perspective, and it's in Matthew that we meet the Magi from the east. Also, in the crucifixion and the death, burial, and resurrection account, we find out that the graves were opened after Jesus died, and many saints of old strolled the streets We're also told about the soldiers that were sent to guard and seal the tomb and how they were bribed after the tomb was opened. There are also a lot of Old Testament quotes in the book of Matthew. My favorite being the one from chapter 9, verse 13. Matthew always gives us, or often gives us, I should say, Old Testament quotes and stories where we don't get them in the other gospel writers. And this is from Matthew's own calling. Matthew is the one who remembers that on that occasion Jesus quoted Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. Learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice. Tells us a lot about the man that he's still carrying that verse in his heart. Well, that's my introduction to the Gospel of Matthew. I've taken up an extra half minute of your time, just like I did yesterday. I'll try not to make this a habit. Tomorrow we look at the Sermon on the Mount. Thank you for joining me for 5 good minutes, and we'll see you tomorrow.